The stillness of the Yemeni night was shattered by the deafening roar of jet engines, their distant hum morphing into an earth-shaking fury as the first U.S. cruise missiles found their targets. The strikes came without warning. 17 coordinated explosions ripped through the darkness, turning the night sky into a hellish inferno. Fireballs erupted from the ground, casting eerie shadows over the desolate, war-torn landscape. Precision-guided munitions rained down with deadly accuracy, each strike meticulously planned to cripple the Houthi military infrastructure. In a matter of seconds, command centers vanished in plumes of smoke, weapons depots were engulfed in raging infernos, and mobile missile launchers, once hidden deep within the rugged mountains and urban sprawl, were obliterated before they could retaliate. But these were more than just military targets. The shockwaves from these strikes would be felt far beyond Yemen, reverberating through the already fragile geopolitical fabric of the Middle East. The world watched in stunned silence. Satellite feeds from intelligence agencies displayed the destruction in real time, grainy infrared footage showing massive craters where strategic outposts once stood. U.S. military officials in the Pentagon remained tight-lipped, their expressions grim as they monitored incoming reports. In the Situation Room of the White House, President Biden sat stone-faced, surrounded by his top advisors, each one aware that this was not just another military operation. This was an escalation, one that could ignite a conflict that would reshape the region for years to come. In the Houthi-controlled strongholds of Sana'a and Sada, the air raid sirens wailed too late. Civilians scrambled for shelter as secondary explosions rocked their neighborhoods, sending tremors through already crumbling infrastructure. For years, Yemenis had endured relentless bombardment. But this was different. This was the full might of the United States military, unleashed in a devastating show of force. Across the Arabian Peninsula, military bases in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain went into high alert, their air defense systems scanning the skies for an inevitable response. In Tehran, the supreme leader convened his most trusted military commanders. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the shadowy force backing the Houthi insurgency, had been preparing for such a moment. Was this a prelude to an all-out confrontation between Iran and the United States? Was Tehran ready to retaliate directly? Or would it unleash its network of proxy forces across the region? As the flames from the missile strikes continued to rise over Yemen, the response was already in motion. Within the hour, encrypted messages were transmitted from Houthi commanders to allied militia groups in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. The order was clear: retaliate against U.S. and allied forces. Moments later, in Baghdad, rockets streaked across the sky, slamming into the green zone near the U.S. Embassy. In Lebanon, Hezbollah fighters armed their long-range missiles, while in the Red Sea, Iranian naval vessels shifted into attack positions. Oil prices spiked instantly, surging past $150 a barrel as the markets panicked at the prospect of a full-blown regional war. In Washington, lawmakers scrambled to contain the fallout, but the die had already been cast. At the United Nations, diplomats pleaded for restraint, their words drowned out by the deafening sounds of war. The Middle East stood on the precipice, and the world held its breath. This wasn't just a military operation, it was the opening salvo in what could become the next great war of the 21st century. And once the first missile was fired, there was no turning back. In the war-scarred capital of Sana'a, the fragile silence of the early morning was shattered by a thunderous explosion that sent shockwaves rippling through the city. It began as a distant, eerie whistle, a harbinger of destruction, before the first missile struck its target with surgical precision. Within seconds, the night sky was transformed into a blinding inferno as a suspected Houthi military headquarters erupted in a towering fireball. The sheer force of the detonation sent a massive shockwave outward, rattling the foundations of nearby buildings and shattering windows in every direction. Streets were instantly illuminated by the raging blaze, the flickering flames casting ghostly shadows as terrified residents stumbled from their homes, shielding their eyes from the searing heat. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burning concrete, metal, and flesh. From the outskirts of the city, panicked voices filled the darkness. Children clung to their parents, some crying, others too stunned to react. The eerie wail of sirens pierced the chaos as emergency responders raced toward the epicenter of destruction, their progress hampered by debris-strewn roads and the choking dust that hung over the city like a funeral shroud. The sheer scale of the blast had left entire city blocks without power, plunging neighborhoods into an uneasy darkness, punctuated only by the dull orange glow of fire. But the destruction was not confined to Sana'a alone. Hundreds of miles away, near the vital port city of Hodeidah, the night was torn apart by a series of devastating secondary explosions. A well-fortified Houthi weapons depot, packed with missiles and ammunition, had been obliterated in a precision airstrike. The resulting blast was even more violent than the one in the capital. Munitions stored deep within the compound ignited in rapid succession, creating a hellish chain reaction that spewed fire and debris into the sky. The explosion was so immense that it could be seen from miles out at sea, the deep orange glow reflecting off the rolling waves like a second sunrise. U.S. Navy warships stationed in the Red Sea reported feeling the distant shockwave rumble through the ocean. In the aftermath of the strike, chaos gripped Hodeidah. Fragments of destroyed missiles and torched artillery shells rained down over residential districts, setting buildings ablaze and igniting fuel reserves. Civilians and fighters alike scrambled for cover as a second wave of explosions sent fiery projectiles hurtling through the air. The screams of the wounded mixed with the distant, guttural roar of jet engines as American aircraft continued their relentless assault. Hours later, U.S. officials confirmed the scope of the operation. The coordinated barrage had been executed by a lethal combination of Fa-18 Super Hornets launched from the deck of the USS Eisenhower and the stealthy, radar-evading F-35 Lightning IIs from an undisclosed airbase in the region. Their mission had been clear: cripple Houthi command centers, neutralize missile stockpiles, and eliminate the insurgents' ability to threaten international shipping lanes. The precision-guided munitions used in the attack had been carefully selected to ensure maximum damage with minimal collateral destruction, but in a city as densely populated as Sana'a, such precision could only go so far. As the sun rose over Yemen, the full extent of the devastation came into view. Black smoke coiled into the sky like funeral pyres, drifting over the city as rescue teams combed through the rubble. Fires raged uncontrollably in the ruins of the Houthi compound, and the streets were littered with the twisted remains of military vehicles and crumbling facades of once proud buildings. In Hodeidah, anxious whispers spread among the population. Was this the beginning of a full-scale U.S. military intervention, or a prelude to a wider regional conflict that could draw in Iran and its allies? Inside the Pentagon, intelligence analysts pored over satellite images and drone footage, assessing the success of the strikes. Meanwhile, in Washington, the president's national security team debated their next move. The strike had sent a clear message, but had it been enough? Would the Houthis, backed by Tehran, retaliate by launching new attacks on U.S. warships, or perhaps on Saudi Arabia and the UAE? The Middle East, already a tinderbox, had just been doused in gasoline. And as the world watched, holding its breath, one question loomed over all others. Was this the first act in a war that no one could control? The Pentagon's official statement was brief, measured, and carefully worded, a calculated message to both allies and adversaries. The airstrikes, they declared, were a necessary response to ongoing Houthi aggression, a direct retaliation against the insurgent group's relentless attacks on international shipping lanes and U.S. military assets in the region. But behind closed doors, intelligence agencies were grappling with a far more unsettling reality, one that had forced Washington's hand. In the days leading up to the strikes, classified reports had begun filtering through the highest levels of the U.S. intelligence apparatus, detailing a rapidly escalating threat. Intercepted communications between Houthi commanders and their Iranian handlers painted a chilling picture. The insurgents were preparing for a coordinated, unprecedented wave of missile and drone attacks, targeting U.S. Navy vessels operating in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. The scale and sophistication of the planned assault surpassed anything previously attempted. This was no mere harassment campaign. It was a potential game-changer, one that could shift the balance of power in the region and drag the U.S. into a deeper, bloodier conflict. Some of the missiles identified in the intercepted transmissions were particularly concerning. Among them were Iranian-made ballistic and cruise missiles with advanced guidance systems capable of striking targets with lethal accuracy from hundreds of miles away. Even more troubling was the presence of a new category of weapons, loitering munitions, or suicide drones, programmed to seek out and destroy high-value targets. These weapons, designed for maximum destruction, had already been deployed in previous skirmishes, but never in numbers like this. Perhaps most alarming was the emergence of highly maneuverable anti-ship missiles with sophisticated electronic countermeasures. These projectiles, equipped with state-of-the-art guidance systems, could weave through layers of missile defense, bypassing traditional interception methods. Senior officials within the Pentagon feared that even the advanced Aegis combat system, the backbone of U.S. naval defense, might not be enough to neutralize such a barrage. The prospect of multiple U.S. warships being struck, potentially crippled or even sunk, was an unacceptable risk. The White House was briefed in an emergency meeting, where military advisors warned that delaying action could lead to catastrophic losses. A successful Houthi attack on American vessels would not only result in the loss of hundreds of sailors, but could also deal an unprecedented psychological blow to U.S. military dominance in the region. The credibility of American deterrence was on the line. Washington had little choice. The decision was made to act preemptively. Strike first, strike hard, and cripple the threat before it could be unleashed. In the hours leading up to the air campaign, intelligence teams monitored a flurry of Houthi activity across Yemen. Satellite imagery revealed missile convoys moving under the cover of night toward coastal launch sites. Drones captured footage of technicians hurriedly preparing launch pads near Al-Hudaydah and Ras Isa, positioning their weapons for what was now a near-inevitable confrontation. Analysts determined that within 48 hours, the insurgents could launch a saturation attack, one that even the most advanced naval defenses might struggle to repel. The order was given. At precisely 2:30 a.m. local time, the first wave of U.S. airstrikes commenced. FA-18 Super Hornets roared off the deck of the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, their payloads locked onto Houthi missile storage depots, command centers, and radar installations. Meanwhile, F-35 Lightning II jets, operating from an undisclosed airbase, conducted deep penetration strikes against hardened underground bunkers believed to house Iran-supplied missile stockpiles. Tomahawk cruise missiles, launched from destroyers stationed in the Red Sea, struck key Houthi logistical hubs, severing their ability to coordinate an immediate counterstrike. The impact was devastating. Within minutes, massive fireballs erupted over northern Yemen, illuminating the landscape for miles. Secondary explosions ripped through ammunition depots, sending shrapnel and debris cascading through the air. Surveillance footage later confirmed the destruction of multiple launch sites before they could be activated. In Sana'a, intelligence officers monitoring Houthi communications overheard panicked transmissions. The Americans knew everything. By dawn, the U.S. had effectively neutralized what could have been one of the most dangerous threats to its naval forces in decades, but the battle was far from over. The Houthis, known for their resilience, would not go down quietly. And in Tehran, where senior military officials had been closely monitoring the strikes, the question was no longer whether to retaliate, but how. Would Iran escalate the conflict, openly confronting the United States? Or would it choose the path of deniability, striking through its vast network of regional proxies? The world watched as tensions soared, teetering on the edge of a conflict that could engulf the entire Middle East. The U.S. had acted decisively, but in doing so, had it set in motion a chain reaction that no one could stop. The human cost and the price of war. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins of Yemen, the true scale of destruction became painfully clear. The night's airstrikes had shattered key Houthi military installations, but they had also left behind a landscape of devastation. Black plumes of smoke curled into the morning sky, rising from the wreckage of buildings reduced to rubble. Fires still raged in the outskirts of Sana'a, their flickering glow casting an eerie light on the grief-stricken faces of those who had survived. Amid the twisted remnants of what had once been bustling neighborhoods, the grim task of assessing the human toll began. While most of the confirmed casualties were Houthi fighters, militants who had been stationed in command centers, missile depots, and radar stations, horrific reports soon surfaced of civilians caught in the crossfire. In Taiz, one of Yemen's most embattled cities, a hospital was quickly overwhelmed with the wounded. Doctors and nurses, already stretched thin by years of war, worked frantically to treat the influx of patients. Many of the injured bore gruesome burns, their skin blackened and peeling from the intense fires ignited by secondary explosions. Others arrived in makeshift ambulances, groaning from shrapnel wounds inflicted by collapsing buildings. In one corner of the hospital, a mother cradled her lifeless child, whispering prayers through her tears as dust and ash clung to her hair. A local doctor, his face etched with exhaustion, described the chaos in chilling detail. "We've treated war wounds before, but this is something else. Some of these injuries are catastrophic. We don't have enough medicine. We don't have enough supplies. People are dying not just from the bombs, but because we can't help them fast enough." Across Yemen, Houthi-controlled media wasted no time broadcasting images of bloodied civilians, destroyed homes, and wailing survivors. The propaganda machine roared to life, painting the strikes not as precision attacks against military targets, but as an indiscriminate massacre of innocent Yemenis. In the halls of power, Houthi leaders seized the moment, calling for immediate and brutal retaliation. The Houthi response, vowing vengeance. At a hastily assembled press conference in Sana'a, a masked Houthi spokesman, his voice shaking with fury, addressed a room packed with reporters and cameras. "America will pay in blood for this crime," he bellowed, his fist slamming against the podium. "We will make their warships burn. We will make their soldiers scream. They believe they can bomb us into submission, but they have only awakened our wrath." Houthi-controlled news channels echoed the call for revenge, airing pre-recorded footage of militant leaders rallying their fighters. The message was clear. Yemen's insurgents would not be cowed. If the U.S. believed its overwhelming military force would deter the Houthis, they were gravely mistaken. Within hours, intelligence operatives monitoring Houthi communications intercepted orders for a swift counterstrike. U.S. satellites tracked frantic activity at rebel missile launch sites, technicians racing to prepare their weapons, fuel trucks moving into position, encrypted radio messages bouncing between commanders. The retaliation would come swiftly, and it would be aimed directly at America. The first retaliatory strike. As tensions reached a breaking point, alarms blared aboard the USS Mason, a guided missile destroyer patrolling the Red Sea as part of a U.S. naval task force. Radar operators detected an incoming projectile streaking across the sky, launched from Houthi-controlled territory near Al-Hudaydah. The ship's crew sprang into action, trained for moments exactly like this. "Missile inbound! Brace for impact!" a voice barked over the intercom. Within seconds, the ship's Aegis combat system locked onto the hostile projectile. A Standard Missile-2 interceptor was launched, slicing through the air at blistering speed. It met its target high above the waves, erupting in a brilliant explosion that scattered debris into the sea below. The attempted strike had been neutralized, but the message had been sent. The Houthis had drawn first blood in what was quickly spiraling into open warfare. Aboard the USS Mason, sailors exchanged glances, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. This was no longer just a tit-for-tat exchange. This was the start of something far more dangerous: escalation and global repercussions. Word of the attack reached Washington within minutes. In the Situation Room of the White House, seniors, military officials gathered to assess the rapidly deteriorating situation. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, flanked by intelligence analysts, reviewed classified satellite images of additional Houthi missile sites being prepped for launch. "This isn't over," he muttered grimly. "They're just getting started." President Biden, after being briefed on the unfolding crisis, faced a grim choice. He could authorize further strikes to neutralize the remaining Houthi missile infrastructure, risking a deeper quagmire, or he could opt for restraint, attempting to de-escalate before the conflict spiraled out of control. Across the Middle East, the fallout was immediate. In Tehran, Iranian officials publicly condemned the U.S. airstrikes, calling them a blatant act of aggression against the people of Yemen. While Iran denied direct involvement in Houthi military operations behind closed doors, its Revolutionary Guard commanders were already strategizing ways to intensify support for their Yemeni allies. Would they escalate by providing the Houthis with even more advanced missile technology? Would they strike at U.S. interests elsewhere in the region? In Riyadh, Saudi Arabia's leaders watched with bated breath. The kingdom, long embroiled in a bitter proxy war against the Houthis, saw both opportunity and danger in America's actions. Would Washington's intervention finally tip the scales in the Saudis' favor? Or would it unleash a new wave of chaos, one that could threaten the kingdom itself? Meanwhile, in Israel, military analysts closely monitored the situation, wary that Hezbollah, another Iranian-backed proxy, might take advantage of the crisis to launch attacks of its own. The Israeli Defense Forces quietly raised their alert levels, preparing for the possibility of a multi-front conflict. Even as world leaders scrambled for solutions, the reality on the ground painted a grim picture. The Houthis, despite suffering losses, had proven resilient time and time again. Their ability to absorb punishment and strike back had made them one of the most formidable insurgent forces in the modern era. And with Iran's shadow looming large, the fight was far from over. A war with no clear end. The morning sun cast its harsh light over Yemen's scarred landscape. Smoke still curled from bombed-out buildings. Families dug through rubble, searching for lost loved ones. Fighter jets continued to circle overhead, their distant roar a reminder that peace was nowhere in sight. For the U.S., the road ahead was fraught with peril. Would further airstrikes break the Houthis' will, or would they only deepen their resolve? Would Washington's show of force deter Iran or embolden it? And most importantly, had America just taken its first irreversible step into another endless war? The answer would soon reveal itself in fire and blood. The global shockwave, a world on edge. As news of the U.S. airstrikes on Yemen spread, global markets reacted with immediate panic. Crude oil prices surged nearly 10% within hours of trading, with Brent crude climbing past $150 per barrel, a level unseen in over a decade. Energy analysts warned that the strikes threatened to disrupt critical shipping lanes, particularly the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a vital choke point through which nearly 10% of the world's seaborne oil flows daily. In London and New York, financial markets tumbled as investors braced for a prolonged conflict that could send shockwaves through the global economy. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted by over 900 points in early trading, while the FTSE 100 in the UK faced its worst single-day drop in over a year. In Asia, the Nikkei 225 and Shanghai Composite indices both closed sharply lower, reflecting growing uncertainty about how far the crisis would escalate. Major shipping companies, fearing an escalation that could make the Red Sea a war zone, began rerouting vessels away from Yemeni waters, adding significant delays and costs to international trade. Insurance premiums for tankers operating near the conflict zone skyrocketed overnight, reflecting the growing risk to global commerce. Amid the financial turbulence, the world's major powers quickly reacted. The diplomatic firestorm, condemnations and warnings. The Russian Foreign Ministry issued a blistering condemnation of the U.S. airstrikes, accusing Washington of reckless aggression and warning that continued interference in the affairs of sovereign nations will have dire consequences. Moscow's rhetoric grew increasingly bellicose, with some Kremlin insiders suggesting that Russia might step up its own involvement in the region. In Beijing, the Chinese government called for an immediate ceasefire, urging all parties to exercise restraint and return to the path of diplomatic negotiation. Behind the scenes, Chinese military planners weighed their options. As a nation deeply dependent on Middle Eastern oil, Beijing had a vested interest in ensuring stability in the Gulf. Yet, with U.S. carrier groups on high alert and the potential for a prolonged military engagement, China also saw an opportunity to expand its influence in the region, perhaps by deepening its ties with Iran and Russia. In Europe, reactions were mixed. France and Germany expressed concern over escalating violence, but stopped short of directly criticizing the U.S. The United Kingdom, a longtime ally of Washington, cautiously supported the strikes while calling for a swift de-escalation to prevent a broader regional conflict. Meanwhile, in the halls of the United Nations, emergency meetings were convened as diplomats scrambled to contain the fallout. Yet despite the flurry of diplomatic activity, the situation remained dangerously volatile. Iran moves to the brink. A new front opens? Reports soon emerged that Iran was moving additional military forces to its border with Yemen, raising fears that Tehran might escalate its involvement in direct retaliation for the U.S. strikes. Iranian state media broadcast footage of armored columns and missile batteries being repositioned in southeastern Iran, near the Gulf of Oman, a clear signal that Tehran was preparing for a possible confrontation. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, the elite military branch tasked with overseeing Iran's foreign military operations, vowed that the U.S. would not escape retribution. While Iranian leaders officially denied any plans for immediate retaliation, intelligence intercepts painted a different picture. Tehran was actively coordinating with Houthi forces, and new shipments of advanced weaponry, including long-range drones and ballistic missiles, were reportedly en route to Yemen. In Washington, U.S. military planners closely monitored the movements. The Pentagon ordered 2 additional carrier strike groups, the USS Theodore Roosevelt and USS George H.W. Bush, into the region, bolstering U.S. naval presence in case of further escalation. At CENTCOM headquarters, senior commanders debated the next course of action. Should the U.S. launch preemptive strikes on Iranian supply lines, or should it wait for Iran to make the next move? The chilling revelation. Russian mercenaries in Yemen. Amid the growing chaos, the most shocking development came from a leaked intelligence report. Analysts reviewing satellite images and intercepted communications found evidence that Russian mercenaries had been spotted assisting Houthi forces in the days before the U.S. strikes. These were no ordinary fighters. They were believed to be operatives from the Wagner Group, the Kremlin-linked paramilitary force that had played a key role in conflicts across Syria, Libya, and Africa. The revelation sent shockwaves through Western intelligence agencies. If confirmed, it meant that Yemen's civil war was no longer just a regional conflict. It was now a proxy war between nuclear powers. The implications were staggering. Would the U.S. risk direct confrontation with Russia by targeting Wagner operatives? Was Moscow using Yemen as a testing ground for new military strategies against the West? Could this conflict spiral into something even larger, perhaps even dragging NATO into the fray? In the Kremlin, Putin's advisors debated their next move. Russia had long supported Iran and its regional proxies, but was it willing to risk a direct clash with the U.S. over Yemen? Some hardliners in Moscow argued that America's actions presented an opportunity to further entrench Russian influence in the Middle East and weaken U.S. dominance in the region. Others warned that escalation could backfire, pulling Russia into yet another costly foreign war. The question that haunted the world: victory or trap? As the sun set on the first day of this new confrontation, military strategists in Washington, Tehran, and Moscow wrestled with a haunting question. Had the United States just won a decisive victory, crippling the Houthis before they could launch devastating attacks on American warships? Or had it stepped into a carefully laid trap, one designed to draw the U.S. deeper into a conflict that could soon spiral beyond anyone's control? For now, the world could only watch and wait. But one thing was certain: the coming days would determine whether these 17 strikes marked the end of hostilities or the beginning of something far worse.